Today on InGrace, we're in Jerusalem, and we're going to talk to award-winning author Joel Rosenberg.
Ever since I was a boy, I've been fascinated with God's creation. I'm traveling the planet to tell His story about His world. I'm Jim Scudder Jr. Come with me on another exciting adventure in grace.
Welcome to InGrace. I'm Jim Scudder Jr., and today we're in Jerusalem to talk to Joel Rosenberg. Joel's books have sold by the millions. He has written nonfiction and fiction. Of course, many of you have read Joel's books. I really enjoyed his last one, Enemies and Allies. And I wanted to sit down and talk to him about the issues surrounding the peace of this land, the peace of Jerusalem, the peace of Israel, the hatred of many in the world against Jewish people, to try to help understand why that is, and also to talk about the incredible Abraham Accords and the amazing delegation trips that he has made with evangelical leaders, with some Muslim countries. And so I think today's InGrace is going to really bless you as you hear more about these important topics. Hey, it's great to have you on InGrace today, Joel. And I've enjoyed your book, Enemies and Allies. Well, let me rephrase that. I didn't enjoy the first part.
Okay, the enemies part.
I was literally scared half to death.
Yeah.
With the axis of the three countries that seem to be coalescing against Israel and, of course, against America.
Yeah. Well, Jim, great to be with you, and welcome back to Israel, and particularly to Jerusalem, the epicenter of the epicenter of the epicenter. Huh. Yeah, look, 20 years after 9/11, I wrote Enemies and Allies because our enemies are very different today than the way we thought of them 20 years ago. 20 years ago, Al-Qaeda was the main threat and set us into motion into 2 decades of war in the Middle East. Yes, against 2 nation states, the Taliban government in Afghanistan and the terrorist network that was sort of permeated throughout Afghanistan. And then, of course, to remove Saddam Hussein from power and then dealing with all the terrorist forces and Iranian proxy forces in Iraq. But most of our fighting over the last 20 years has been against non-state actors. Mm-hmm. It wasn't that difficult to bring down the Taliban government or the Saddam government. But all the terrorists and proxy militia forces, that was extraordinarily different. And we had the rise of ISIS, the Islamic State, genocide against Christians. I mean, it's been a brutal, horrific 20 years here in the Middle East. But that is mostly changed, right? And as I describe in Enemies and Allies, from interviewing, the key leaders that were involved in this, Secretary of State then Mike Pompeo, President Trump, whose policies just brought down the ISIS caliphate, ended the genocide against Christians. Not alone. Obviously, the United States worked with our Kurdish and Arab allies and so forth. But we don't think of Al-Qaeda as the main serious threat. It's still a threat. Mm-hmm. ISIS is still there, but it's not a major strategic threat like it was. Iran. Iran, not the people, but the government. This is the single biggest threat in the region. Made worse, as you alluded to, as I described in the book, because Iran, in its inability so far to build nuclear warheads, has decided to build out alliances with very serious, dangerous actors. Vladimir Putin in Russia, Recep Erdogan in Turkey, and then you add the Chinese and the North Koreans, and suddenly the Iranian regime, horrible on its own right, wanting to annihilate, wipe out Israel, is forming this broader alliance with very dangerous players. And most Americans, I don't think, have thought about who are our enemies in this region today, and thought it through carefully. And that's what the first part of the book is trying to do.
And you laid it out incredibly well to talk about, Iran and what they do. And again, not the people, but certainly the leadership.
Yeah.
And then even Erdogan's changing, and certainly is militant, and certainly wants nothing to do with NATO and all of these other things.
Erdogan is playing both sides He's trying to claim to remain a NATO ally, and yet every move he's making, or nearly every move, is moving Turkey from a moderate, friendly, pro-Western, pro-American ally to the dark side, to an alliance with Russia, with Iran, and with other dangerous actors to the east. So Turkey had been the model of a moderate Muslim government, a moderate Muslim nation, from the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the Caliphate, the Islamic Kingdom, in the early 1920s to today, or almost to today. Turkey has been the model, the paragon, the example. You'd say, well, see, a Muslim country can be very moderate, very pro-American, very pro-Western, even friendly to Israel. And yet, Erdogan is taking Turkey in the exact wrong direction. Again, it's not something that Washington is confronting much. The news media in the West and in the United States is ignoring this. This is a major strategic change, because Turkey's got the largest army in Europe.
Right.
It's a Muslim army, and it's moving against NATO. And yet, as I note in the book, NATO doesn't have any provision in its charter to evict or eject a member nation. So NATO doesn't know what to do. Biden doesn't know what to do. What do you do with a country that's turning against you and is actually part of the alliance, has all the access to your intelligence and your political systems? That's a huge problem.
Israel gets the danger of radical Islam, obviously. This country has been in a state of survival for many, many years, very strong now militarily, and has some security, but still faces these things often. America, we used to feel pretty protected and safe. That changed 20 years ago. But maybe that's fading from our memories. And maybe we're not taking the evil as seriously as we should. Do you agree with that?
Well, I would say that, look, one of the challenges here, Jim, is that I don't want to be a partisan. If you're just doing straight analysis of what has happened, one of the challenges you have to say is that some leaders in Washington, in the United States, understand the threat of radical Islamism, and some do not. President Obama did not. Then Vice President, now President Joe Biden, does not understand this threat. And we see it in the actions they take. I'm not trying to be a partisan. I'm just saying, Joe Biden has 50 years of experience in Washington. But even some of his closest friends say, I love Joe Biden, but he's been wrong on every foreign policy and national security issue for the last half century. That's his friends. Former defense secretary under the Obama-Biden administration, Robert Gates, famously said, not in a quip, but in his memoirs, Gates wrote, I love Biden. If I had a personal crisis, I would call Biden. He's just a warm and friendly man. But he's been wrong on every issue on foreign policy and national security for the last 50 years. It's not entirely true. And I, in fairness, in enemies and allies, I separate out what are some of the things that Biden has done right. He's super pro-Israel.
Yes.
He calls himself a Zionist. He has helped us build the Iron Dome system with American funding. Even recently, when radical anti-Israel forces in Congress, in the Democratic Party, were trying to block funding to replenish all the Iron Dome rocket interceptors that we used up during our recent war with Hamas in Gaza, Biden stood firm and did supply, and is in the process of supplying $1 billion worth of Iron Dome funding to Israel. So Biden gets credit for this.
Yes.
However, why would his friends say this? Obama himself, President Obama, has said on the record, don't ever underestimate Joe Biden's penchant for messing up. That's not the word he used. Messing up a situation. These are his friends.
Yes.
Are warning that his judgment is flawed. Why? Well, I won't go on and on, but just use the example of surrendering to the Taliban just before the 20th anniversary of 9/11. We had won Afghanistan. Yeah, Afghanistan's messy. I've been there. I've met with tribal Muslim leaders. I've met with Christian Afghans on the ground. It's a difficult, poverty-stricken, troubled country, and it's always going to be. But it was stable, and the U.S. was able to reduce troop levels and work with our NATO forces and maintain the Afghan army, and they were doing the fighting. Well, Americans weren't dying in Afghanistan. The Afghan soldiers were dying in the fight against the radicals, against the terrorists, against the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS. And Biden came along and pulled the Jenga stick out of the game, and the whole thing collapsed, leaving Americans behind enemy lines, leaving $80-some billion worth of American high-tech military hardware in Afghanistan, stunning our allies, rattling our allies, emboldening our enemies. That was just in September, late August, September. That's a problem. It's a huge problem. And it comes from Biden's sense that I've been doing this 50 years. I know what I'm doing. And the evidence suggests that actually he does not overall when it comes to the threat of radical Islam. He wants to make a deal with the Iranian regime. But we've already tried that. He tried that with Obama. They gave $150 billion to the Iranian regime, but Iran is closer to nuclear weapons today and keeps funding radical terror forces in the region. Iran keeps destabilizing the region. Biden wants to do it again. Like, you just tried that. It didn't work. And the Trump, Pence, Pompeo team did it very differently. And again, that all sounds like a partisan. So that's difficult. I had a lot of criticisms of President Trump. I was against him in 2016. I was a never Trumper. But I did see him do things that were right. And when I met with him in the Oval Office, a story that I tell in Enemies and Allies, I said to him, listen, I have criticisms of you. I've had them. But when I look at what you're doing, your policies, your personnel, and the accomplishments you're actually making, especially in the Middle East, where I care a great deal about, you're achieving so many successes. And whether you love them or hate either one of them, having a fair analysis of both men, Trump and Biden, is important to, at least for Americans, to understand, well, what policies work. Regardless of how much time you've had in Washington, which policies are working and which are not. And I think it's clear, but it sounds partisan. And right. I don't intend that.
I think you were fair. And when you talked about President Biden, you were respectful and you did credit him when you could. But contrasting two presidencies that have been completed, Obama and Trump. And I think I was about as surprised as you were. We were really excited about Ted Cruz, and it came down to Trump would be the nominee. And so we weren't sure what to think and what was going to happen. Were we surprised, though, especially when it came to Israel and how much he got behind Israel and all the things that he did, of course, the embassy being the most astounding to me, where that can seem to be kicked down the road so many years. We've had friends, Congressman Phil Crane was a friend, and others. Peter Roscom, I think, also did some great legislation for Israel. But to see what Trump did was just a blessing for Israel and what that eventually led to. And the first part of the book was about the enemies, and that's scary. But the heartwarming part of the book was to see what has transpired not just about a year ago, the Abraham Accords. And you had a front row seat, and I will even suggest a part in kind of some of the things that transpired. You're modest and you probably wouldn't say that, but I see it as all of your delegation trips with evangelical leaders, unprecedented trips to a number of moderate Muslim nations, has led to something unbelievable. And that is a peace agreements with a number of countries and perhaps more to come.
Well, I don't take any credit. I don't think we played an element in these things happening. But you're right. We did get a front row seat. We also got a backstage pass in these things happening. And in a sense, that the fact that Arab kings and crown princes, presidents and prime ministers throughout this region decided to invite me an American, Israeli, Jewish, evangelical Zionist with 2 sons who've served in the Israeli army. Why would the Saudi leadership invite me? They've never invited Christian leaders into the palace in 300 years, they told me, but they asked me to bring a delegation. The United Arab Emirates has never invited Christian leaders into the palace. No delegation like this, an evangelical delegation, in the entire history of the country. And they asked me why, and the other countries too. So I think that while we didn't play a factor in bringing peace, the fact that they wanted to talk about peace with us and human rights and religious freedom and the threat from Iran and the threat from radical Islamism, and then, as we said, as peace with Israel was a bit of evidence before the Abraham Accords happened that attitudes were changing, okay? Going back just for a moment into the Oval Office conversation I had with President Trump, that too was prior to the Abraham Accords coming to pass. But what I said to him, I said, my criticisms and concerns about you, I don't know, withstanding maybe, I'm stunned by how much you've gotten done. You did move the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, fulfilling a law that was passed with overwhelming bipartisan support in Congress in 1995. Okay, this wasn't some new, let's just do something. Every American president, Democrat and Republican, for 20 years was saying they would do it. They didn't do it. 25 years. Trump did it. He also recognized that Israel has sovereignty over the Golan Heights. He just declared that Jerusalem is Israel's capital. He offered a peace treaty to the Palestinians. Israelis said yes. The Palestinians wouldn't even discuss it. And then came 4 Arab-Israeli peace agreements in which everybody in what I call the peace industry in Washington, all the experts, all the former senior officials who are absolutely certain they know how to make peace between Israel and the Arab world, and even though they've never done it, they said Trump's a moron, he's a novice, he has no experience. Not only will he not make peace between Israel and the Arab world, he'll make things worse. And I quote in the book person after person after person. You can see the direct quotes. Famously, I guess, former Secretary of State John Kerry, he goes, I know how this is done. I've had 300 calls and conversations with Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. I know, and I'm telling you that people are out there saying that if you just set the Palestinian leadership aside and you just focus on Israel and the Arab world, that you can actually make peace. I'm telling you, no. He said it 4 times. Yes. And what do we have? 4 Arab-Israeli peace agreements between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. Those are Arab countries. But there's a 5th, that's Kosovo, a Muslim majority country, not Arab ethnically, but Muslim majority, that also normalized relations with it. This is huge. And it's kind of crazy that if there is such thing as a Nobel Peace Prize, you can't win for making 4 or 5 Muslim-Israeli peace and normalization agreements. I mean, that just devalues the concept. But it happened.
Yes.
And it happened under the leadership of a president that, was taking incoming fire, even from his friends, and sometimes rightly so, for the tweets and the comments.
Sure.
This is big. And so in the book, I describe, this is the only book so far, Enemies and Allies, that takes you inside to show you the inside story of how the Abraham Accords were actually negotiated, how they happened, why they happened, why now. With the United States moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, this was the single biggest thing that the peace industry said. There'll never be peace in this region because you've just lit a match and thrown it onto a pile of gas-soaked logs. Like, that thing's going to blow up. It didn't. The exact opposite. We didn't have riots here. There weren't riots in the Arab Muslim world. We got 4 peace treaties out of it. 5 if you count the Kosovo. That's huge. How did that happen? And that's the story I tell in the book.
Part of the story is talking about Saudi Arabia, and they have not yet entered into such an agreement. But I feel like you're hopeful, and explain that. Do you think that could happen?
Yeah. So again, not only am I the first Christian leader that was invited to bring a delegation to meet the leadership of Saudi Arabia, and not just once, we actually went twice, and I tell both stories in the book. But I'm actually the first and only Israeli citizen that has ever publicly met with the leadership of Saudi Arabia. Now, that's crazy, Jim. That makes no sense.
Yeah.
A Jewish evangelical Israeli, a Messianic Jew, like how does it even happen? Like it shouldn't happen historically, but it did. Part of our conversations with Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince and heir to the throne, and effectively the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, because his father, King Salman, keeping the big picture oversight, but he's really deputized his son to run day-to-day internal and foreign affairs. So this is the player, MBS we call him. In our conversations, a 2-hour conversation the first trip, and then 2 hours with the crown prince on the second trip, and then many, 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 many more hours with his inner circles. In both conversations, we asked him, are you ready to make peace with Israel, even if the Palestinian leadership is not ready? Now, Jim, keep in mind that the conversations we had, both of them, one in November of 2018, and then the next year in September of 2019, both of those predate the Abraham Accords, right? It wasn't like obvious that the Arab world was going to begin to make peace with Israel. But in both conversations, we said, listen, there's 3 things you need to know about how evangelicals view this situation. Number 1, we love Israel. We love the Jewish people as evangelicals, 600 million evangelicals worldwide. This is a theological position for us. It's not political.
Right.
It has political implications, but it's not political. It's theological. So you can't move us on this. So you just need to know that from us. We don't know what you know about evangelicals, but we want to tell you. So that's one. The second thing is Jesus commands us to love our neighbors. So we don't hate Palestinians. We love the Palestinians. We don't exactly know how to help Israelis and Palestinians find peaceful, prosperous, calm coexistence. That eludes us. We're not here with a plan, but we want you to know that we don't see it as zero sum. We're not here to tell you because we love Israel, we can't stand Palestinians or Muslims or Arabs more generally. But that's important. We conceded to him that, some evangelicals speak very harshly or in a demeaning way about Palestinians. That's a mistake. It's not the way Christ teaches us to be. But anyway, so we explained that. The third thing we said is we're commanded to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. And so that means we've been praying for a long time for peace between Israel and her neighbors. And that's when I said, so we're curious, if the Palestinian leadership is not yet ready to make peace with Israel in the near future, we are praying, who will be the next Arab leader to make peace? Now, we'd had this conversation in the United Arab Emirates with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed. And he had stunned us at this moment, after I'd said those 3 things, by saying, it's going to be me, Joel. I'm ready. And we're like, what? And he explained to us how he'd come to the decision. In the UAE, we're ready. We believe it's in our national interest to make peace with Israel. And sure enough, 2 years later, the UAE was first to enter the Abraham Accords. So now we're having the exact same conversation with MBS in Saudi Arabia. Now, his answers are off the record. But let's look at the public record. And again, I described this in Enemies and Allies. What can we just see by the public record? Well, number 1, when the Abraham Accords happened, Saudi Arabia did not oppose them. Now, when Egypt made peace with Israel in 1979, Saudi Arabia and the entire Arab Muslim world pulled out of Cairo, condemned President Sadat, and pulled the entire Arab League out of Cairo and boycotted Egypt. That was the Saudi and broader Arab reaction to peace in 1979. Today, the Saudis have embraced, encouraged, spoken very positively about the Abraham Accords. That's interesting. Not only did they speak positive, they haven't thrown monkey wrenches into the works behind the scenes. Third, they've allowed Bahraini, Emirati, and Israeli aircraft to fly over Saudi territory, shortening the distances and allowing direct flights for the first time in human history between Israel and the Gulf. They didn't have to do that, but they did. Then, if this were not enough, in December of 2020, Mohammed bin Salman invited Israeli Prime Minister at that time, Benjamin Netanyahu, and the head of our spy agency, Yossi Cohen, the head of Mossad, to visit Saudi Arabia, along with then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, for a secret set of meetings. Like, wow. Now, of course, the story leaked. Our news agency that I run, All Israel News, was the first to confirm that this was not just rumor. This would actually happen, and I write about it in the book. But you just take those statements or those actions, and you say, clearly the Saudis are moving in a positive direction towards normalization. When and how they make their final decision, I think they will. I actually do believe that the Saudis are going to make peace with Israel, but I don't know when. And I know that every enemy force in the region is trying to dissuade them. And I wrote a novel about this, The Jerusalem Assassin, about a Saudi leader who wants to make peace with Israel. And then all the bad guys come out of the woodwork to try to blow this thing up, a peace summit right here in Jerusalem. So your viewers may find that interesting if they're trying to extrapolate out how this might happen.
There was a very tense part of the book. You were invited to Saudi Arabia, and then something major happened. It was the murder of Khashoggi in Turkey. And you didn't hear anything from Saudi Arabia about the trip, and you were even wondering, would you even go? Because what had happened and who was responsible? But it all ended up happening where you were heading in a vehicle to go make this first meeting with Salman. And you were writing about the ride, and you knew the first question had to be about Khashoggi. And then you said you felt a peace about it. So maybe walk us through that moment. And I was tense for you reading all these months later, but the boldness of going, the boldness of confronting him with this, because this is a major story, obviously, and a lot of people have criticized, all of that happened, and they should. So walk us through that.
So the murder of Jamal Khashoggi was horrific, absolutely unconscionable. There's no justification. There's no possible justification for it. Jamal Khashoggi was a Saudi journalist, a Saudi citizen, a Saudi dissident. He had been close to the royal family for a period of time, even had worked for the Saudi government, I believe, in one of the Saudi embassies, I think in the United States for a while, and then had turned on the government and had become very close to the Turkish government. The Turkish government under Erdogan hates the Saudis and Erdogan wants to be the leader of the Sunni Muslim world. And Erdogan is promoting the Muslim Brotherhood and other radical Islamist political and terror movements. And so Khashoggi was now outside of Saudi Arabia, was engaged to a Turk, was building a close relationship with Turkish President Erdogan. He's a longtime member himself of the Muslim Brotherhood and was super critical of MBS and the government. Now, those are not justifications for murdering somebody, much less chopping a person up in little pieces, right? It's just absolutely sickening. But that was the context in which a Saudi team of security officials came to try to at least arrest Khashoggi and bring him back to Saudi Arabia. Now, Khashoggi was in Turkey and was trying to get a visa for his wife and confirm his own marriage to this Turk. He went into this Saudi consulate. He never came out. When the story blew up and went public that he was missing, that Khashoggi was missing, and then the rumors began surging that he had been murdered and murdered horrifically, chopped up in little pieces inside a Saudi consulate in Turkey, this became a global firestorm. Okay, the story broke in early October of 2018. Now, in the summer and late summer, early fall of 2018, I had been in contact with Saudi and other regional officials, and they were indicating to me that they wanted me to bring the first ever evangelical delegation to Saudi Arabia. And then I got the formal invitation. It's in the book. I think it was early September. In late September, I met in New York with the Saudi foreign minister, Adel al-Jubeir, to discuss our plans going forward. And that's when he told me, you're the first Christian delegation in 300 years to ever be invited to come inside the palace and meet with the leadership of Saudi Arabia. I didn't know that. And then just a few days, weeks later, this story breaks. Okay, so what do you do, right? It was a small delegation of evangelical leaders, maybe 10 people total, and we discussed it, we prayed about it, but we were a bit torn. Not a lot of people knew we were going to go, that we'd been invited and that we had accepted. But those who knew said, you shouldn't go. This is the wrong time. And by going, you're sort of, you're maybe giving cover to the Saudi government. Now, the question, of course, the central question was, did MBS know that Khashoggi was going to be murdered? Did he order the murder? Did he order this man to be just captured and brought back to Saudi Arabia? Or is this something that was happening at lower levels and had nothing to do with the crown prince? We didn't have any answers to those questions. One of the things we struggled with is if we cancel and we don't go to meet with MBS and his team, we have suddenly become judge and jury. Like, this is a very fast-moving and controversial story, and there's not a lot of actual facts on the table yet. But if we say no, then we're sort of saying, we don't want to have anything to do with you people. There was a case for that. The rest of the world was doing that.
Yeah.
Business leaders were fleeing. No U.S. senators were coming. It was like the whole place was verboten, like it was radioactive. Nobody was going to Riyadh to meet with MBS. The problem, that the tension was, we're the first Christian leaders in 300 years to be invited. If the invitation is still valid, point you just raised was a question. If it's still valid and we don't go, are we closing the door for another 100 years, 300 years, whatever? And how are we going to talk about the fact that there are 1.4 million Christians in Saudi Arabia?
Right.
Now, these are foreign nationals who are working in the oil fields and the hotels and the restaurants and the service sector. It's the workers and their families. 1.4 million Christians living in Saudi Arabia. There's not a single church there. How do we advocate for the opening of churches? How do we advocate for Saudi Arabia to make peace with Israel? How do you advocate if you're not in the room? You write an op-ed, try to tweet. But it's all about relationships in this part of the world. And this was difficult. And yet, if you go, you can't sort of ignore this horrifying thing. And by the way, if you walk in, are you walking in on a man that's maligned and misunderstood and unfairly accused? Or are you walking in to meet the director of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre? It matters.
I know.
And you don't know. And are you planning to do it as a Jew, as an evangelical, as an Israeli citizen? So that's the setup. I'll be happy to, let me stop there for a moment so people can just process the situation. I will say one other thing. As we looked at the scriptures, we said, okay, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego certainly spoke to King Nebuchadnezzar. It's a king who was throwing Jews into fiery furnaces. However, they were slaves of the Babylonian Empire. They had to do it. I mean, they could have said no, but God told them to say yes and to advise. Okay, so that's one model, but we're not slaves of the Saudis, so is that relevant to us? The Apostle Paul wanted to go speak to Nero. That was a pretty brutal Caesar dictator, hated Christians, burning them at the stake. Paul wanted to go meet with them. Why? To be a witness for Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the way he got there was in chains. But his initial calling in Acts chapter 9, as you know, Jim, and I'm sure your viewers do too, the calling was, you will be my witness to the Gentiles, to kings, and to the sons of Israel. Many Christians forget that while Paul was primarily an apostle to the Gentiles, yes, he had a ministry to the Jews, but he also had a ministry to leaders, to governors, to kings, to people at very high places. Is that something we're supposed to do? I'm not the Apostle Paul. So let me stop there. But I just want you to see the kind of what we were wrestling through.
You're driving, and I believe that you were still processing all this. You did decide to go,
right?
Obviously, and I think properly, who will be the voice for those Christians there. And you talked about building churches. You talked about freedom, religious freedom. So you tackled that, but you also tackled the big question that really the whole world wanted to know.
Yeah, we had to start in the conversation with the Khashoggi issue. Did you order this murder? You've arrested a bunch of people for being involved in it, for doing it. What's the plan? How are you going to make this thing right? Those were the questions we opened up with, and several of us asked from multiple angles, but we definitely started there, and we decided to go because we felt we don't know what the situation is, but God has opened a door. We prayed for an open door. God gave us the open door. We didn't say, Lord, only send us if it's quiet and friendly, and we're going to get an ice cream cone and a popsicle, or a lollipop. The Saudi government it's a forbidden kingdom, and it has not been friendly to Christians. It has not been friendly to Jews historically. But we believe you're asking us to go, so help us do it. This was an on-the-record conversation, except for the Israel part. So we asked, and as readers of Enemies and Allies will see, you can see the conversation play out. We weren't there as prosecutors, and we weren't there as investigators. So we asked the questions to get his answer, to read his eyes, to read his body language, and that of his inner circle. But after that, what else are you supposed to do? He said he didn't order this. He didn't even know about it. But he did take responsibility because he's the head of the government. He's the head. So he said, I have to take responsibility. And these people are going to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And as I talk about later, that is exactly what happened. Now, to date, there's not a single shred of public evidence that says that MBS knew that these people that this man was going to be murdered or that he'd ordered it. A lot of people have said that's the case, but there's actually not any evidence. If there is evidence, it's not public. So how do you handle that? So our internal answer was, we're going to go, we're going to ask these questions. We're going to just trust God to be merciful to us in doing so. We're going to get his answers on the record. And then we're going to start dealing with every other hard issue, including what about the textbooks in your schools that teach all kinds of anti-Semitic, anti-Christian terrible things? What are you doing about that? What about the clerics in your mosques that preach all kinds of extremism and hatred and anti-Semitism and anti-Christianity and so forth? What are you doing about that? How are you facing? Well, what do you think of the Ayatollah Khamenei? Right, you're a Muslim. He's a Muslim. On that one, by the way, MBS said to me, Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, is the new Hitler. That's in the book. I mean, it's kind of amazing because that's also how everybody on our delegation sees the leader of Iran. Again, not the people of Iran, but the leadership. So it was a stressful conversation, but it eased up over time because he was quite candid. We asked him about opening churches, and he said, I'm not doing it right now. I said, why not? He said, you shouldn't even want me to do it right now. I say, why not? Now, I'm tempted to tell you, Jim, that your people should just read the book and you'll get the answer. But I will say, in brief, he said, I've got a whole plan of things I want to get done. I'm opening up driving schools so that women can now legally drive in Saudi Arabia. That never happened. That women can attend soccer matches, that the women can serve in the police forces and the army even. And he was changing all these things. But he goes, I have a whole list of things to do, economic and social changes. If I start opening churches, this is going to just inflame the extremists, the terrorists, and they're going to start bombing these churches, and it's going to undermine my set of objectives. We didn't leave it at that. In both trips, we pressed him. Listen, this is a thing. You really need to allow churches to open. He's not ready yet. It's not what we wanted to hear, but it's evidence that he wasn't just telling us what we wanted to hear. Mm-hmm. We prayed and we said, look, and the Lord did give me a sense of peace that we will be criticized, and we've been criticized since in some very, very harsh ways, and I expect more criticism to come. But this is part of being a witness for Jesus. Is think of Jonah, he didn't want to go to Nineveh because he didn't want to be a witness to the people of Nineveh. And when the people of Nineveh repented, he was suicidal. God, I knew this would happen. I knew you'd be merciful. That's not the way.
No.
And yet some people hate the Arabs and the Muslims so much that they don't want followers of Jesus to go build relationships. Or they think that we're a sellout if we try.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand it, but I disagree with that. And I'll add one more thing. I said to the Crown Prince at one point, the term evangelical Christian, I'm just guessing, is not a term used much here in the kingdom. Is that a fair assessment? He chuckled and he said, yeah, that's fair. I said, well, we're grateful that you invited us as evangelicals. I've got an ordained pastor in the delegation. Could he just explain for a few minutes, what is an evangelical Christian and what do we believe? And the Crown Prince said, sure. And so that conversation, as Skip Heitzig, who's on the board of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, walked through the gospel of Jesus Christ with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, that's right on the record. Because we asked him if we could explain it. We weren't hiding our faith. He asked us to come as evangelicals. Let's have the conversation. We asked him, what are your prayer requests? We asked him, can we pray for you at the end of the meeting in the name of Jesus? And he said yes. And so we did. I don't want to say that we weren't proselytizing. We weren't trying to deceive him or coerce him. We were just trying to be faithful witnesses and talk about the things we want to talk about things he wants to talk about. And there's literally not a single book that's ever been published so far about MBS that has him on the record. 2 Wall Street Journal reporters wrote an entire biography about MBS. They never met him, never talked to him. A New York Times reporter did an entire biography about MBS, never met him, never interviewed him. A former senior CIA official wrote a whole book about U.S.-Saudi relations, including MBS. Never met him, never talked to him. This is the only book that there is. And whether you agree with him or disagree with him, love him or hate him, at least you get to hear him and you get to come into the room with us.
So my feeling, Joel, is that you had the opportunity to be a light, to be a friend, to care for people, and also to talk about religious freedom and talk about, making sure Christians aren't persecuted. And so I'm thankful that you all went on not just that trip, but all the other trips to Egypt, to Jordan, to the Emirates, all of these places that you have gone, and you've had the opportunity to explain what is a Christian, what is an evangelical, and in that is sharing the gospel, which is, to me, the essence of, it's the answer, it's the hope, and it's the love of God explained to the world. And so I've noticed that with your books. Now, I'll just confess this. I've heard about this author that had some predictions in his first book, fiction book, that seemed to come true, unfortunately, on 9/11. But I hadn't read any of your books until I saw this one. And I said, you know what, this one looks really interesting to me, and I read it, and it was fantastic. So then...
It took me 21 books to
get to the one.
Okay, well, whatever it takes.
Joel, so I also have got The Last Jihad, which is the first one.
Yes.
So you wrote this fiction book, but you had begun the book about a terrorist using an airplane as a missile against the United States.
Yeah.
And you wrote that 9 months.
Yeah, 9 months before
9/11.
Right.
And so obviously that thrust you into the light, but also it's good writing, it's good reading. Did you ever imagine penning that book where you are today, having been in the presence and influencing all of these leaders?
No, so when I wrote The Last Jihad, which again, as you say, started with this kamikaze attack, this hijacked plane, flying it into an American city, never been a novel written like that. And then that's the opening chapters. Then it leads to the fictional American president deciding to remove Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq.
Stop. I only read half the book.
Okay,
Joel.
well,
Don't ruin it for me.
That's the trajectory of where we're going. No, when you write your first novel, you just want your mother to be able to find it at a bookstore within 100 miles of her house, right? You can't. It'd be fun to be a bestseller, but you can't base your life on that. And the idea that Middle East monarchs and presidents and their advisors and ambassadors and prime ministers and stuff would read your books. It's 5 million copies sold. No, none of that was foreseeable. I'm a dreamer, but that really falls into the Ephesians 3:20 category. This was beyond what I could hope for, dream of, or imagine. God had a plan. But what I was coming out of was being a failed political consultant for almost 10 years in Washington. Every political leader I'd worked for had lost his election or had been, maybe they won, but years after I was involved in their work. So I was not thinking of, God really gave me a lot of gifts. I was feeling like I'm the one Jewish person in America, born and raised in America, that didn't get the financial gene. Not your stockbroker, your hedge fund manager, your CPA. I didn't get the doctor gene, the lawyer gene. I wasn't running a movie company. Like I felt a little bitter at God. Like, I'm a failed political consultant, and you haven't given me any of the good classic Jewish, job skill sets. But making things up for a living apparently was my way. And the novels have really opened doors that, like we've just discussed. But one other thing, and this new book, of course, Enemies and Allies, is not fiction. It's not a political thriller. It's a political thriller, but it's nonfiction. It's really a memoir of the recent years of doors that have opened, not just in the Arab Muslim world, but in the Oval Office, meeting with the president of Israel and the defense minister of Israel and so forth. And wanting to take people into this world to see in real time what's going on. Mm-hmm. What are the changes going on in this region? But also last year, September 2020, I launched 2 new websites, news and analysis sites, All Israel News and All Arab News. Mm-hmm. Why? Because a nonfiction book like Enemies and Allies can track and it can provide the big picture of what's going on. But it's a fast-moving story over here. Mm-hmm. And Christians in the United States and elsewhere around the world keep telling me, I don't know what to read that I can trust to provide news and analysis of what's going on in Israel, much less in the Arab Muslim world. And I'm losing, people are saying, I don't have any confidence in the New York Times or in, Washington Post or others, the CBS Evening News. So where should I get my news? So I decided to launch these 2 sites, All Israel News, All Arab News. And we've gotten exclusive interviews with many of the top newsmakers here mm-hmm. and in the region. And we've got 65,000 people signed up now for our free email newsletters already, just in the first year, where we send you the headlines of the day. And we're providing analysis, not just coverage of what's happening, but analysis from a biblical worldview. And it's exciting. And I think that this is a region God wants us to understand.
Yes.
Yes, the geopolitical events. Yes, the economic events. Yes, the military threats and issues. But also the archaeology, the culture, what's going on in the church here in Israel and in the neighbors. And how do we pray? Yeah, we're supposed to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. But once you've said, Lord, please bring peace to the Middle East, how else are you supposed to pray? Well, you have to understand more what's happening. Right. How do I pray for the leaders? How do I pray for the pastors here? So we're trying to do that. And that's something, my team and I are excited about as well.
There was a prophet of Israel. His name was Ezekiel, and he was in captivity in Babylon, and he was writing. And he wrote some pretty fantastic things that have not been yet fulfilled.
Right.
One is referenced as the Battle of Gog and Magog. So do you see that tying in Ezekiel 38 and 39 with what you're describing as the enemies of Israel and enemies of the United States, which would be Russia, Turkey, and Iran?
It's a good question, Jim. Actually, my first nonfiction book that I ever wrote back in 2006 was called Epicenter. And a big part of Epicenter was about the Ezekiel 38 and 39 prophecies and what do they mean and what's happening in the region that may suggest we're getting closer. That was 15 years ago. Well, I also discussed towards the end of Enemies and Allies, this prophecy. I don't go into as much detail. But your question is really apt and timely because, first of all, let me be super honest. I don't know if the current events are in fact setting into motion the somewhat near fulfillment of the war of Gog and Magog. We don't know yet. But it's really curious and compelling to me how recent geopolitical events and changes in the region are so consistent with the prophecies. And therefore, I think it's incumbent upon followers of Jesus Christ, and particularly pastors and ministry leaders, to be thinking, maybe I ought to brush up on Ezekiel 38 and 39 to be aware of what are those prophecies really saying, and is it possible that in coming years or decades, but maybe sooner, could this thing play out? That seems crazy, but the prophecy is essentially that Israel has to be reborn as a sovereign nation state in the end of days. Check. Okay, and that's largely the prophecies of Ezekiel 36 and 37. And then those include Jews have to be streaming back into the Holy Land to resettle after centuries of exile. Check. Jews have to be rebuilding the ancient ruins. Check. Jews have to be making the deserts bloom with God's grace and mercy. Check. Israel has to become a very powerful country with an exceedingly great army. Check. And Israel has to become increasingly prosperous according to the prophecies. And Israel's one of the most prosperous countries in the region. And without a discovery of oil, we now have discovered massive amounts of natural gas and some oil, but mostly it's a high-tech sector and a tourism industry, which I hope will kick in again as we move, hopefully, past this pandemic plague that really is, I believe, one of the Matthew 24 and Luke 21 signs. The last piece is Israelis have to feel like they're living securely in the land. The text of Ezekiel 38 and 39 doesn't say that there's peace, but it says Israelis feel secure in the land. Well, Israelis feel more secure today than ever. Why? Because we have a peace treaty with Egypt. We have a peace treaty with Jordan. We have a peace treaty with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Sudan and Morocco and Kosovo. We have the strongest military in the region, including the most advanced F-35 stealth fighter aircraft that can reach Iran, if we had to, without them even knowing. We have submarines with some very high-powered weapons on them, lurking presumably off the coast of Iran and elsewhere if we need them. We're in the closest possible alliance with the world's only superpower. For all those reasons, it certainly looks like the precursors to the prophecy coming to pass are all in place. So what happens in the prophecy? Well, Magog is Russia. If you do the historical detective work, again, I explained that in Epicenter. Turkey is Gomer, ancient Gomer, which is mentioned in the prophecy. Persia is the ancient name for Iran. These are the countries that are the key countries, but there are others that will form an alliance to come against Israel in the last days. Now, just north of us in Syria, there are 3 nations whose militaries are there for the first time in human history: Russia, Iran, and Turkey. Now, I'm not saying that we're there yet, necessarily, right? Maybe God's going to kick the prophetic can up the road 50 years, 100 years. Maybe this is like a wave of the shore that looks really close and then is going to recede and unravel. One example, Sudan is a country that was always close to Russia and Iran, but it just made a peace treaty with Israel. But Sudan is ancient Kush, and Kush is one of the countries that's supposed to come against Israel in this alliance. So at the moment, Sudan is an X factor that suggests we're not quite there yet. We've got to keep an eye on Sudan, right? So what's going on? So the answer is we don't know the timing. But the trend lines are so interesting. They're so compelling that I think we need to be praying and saying, Lord, what's our responsibility as followers of Jesus Christ to be strengthening the church here in Israel, to be strengthening the church in Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan, in Iraq, in Egypt, and throughout the region? How do we be a witness to make sure everyone in this region has at least heard the gospel? How can they believe if they haven't heard? How can they hear if nobody tells them? How can somebody tell them unless they're sent, unless they're trained, encouraged, funded? This is a big responsibility because we don't know when those judgments of the enemies of Israel are coming, divine judgments. That's what the text is about. But also the supernatural intervention to protect Israel. We don't know when that's going to happen. But there's a lot of seeds that have to be planted. There's a lot of work that has to be done because otherwise, a lot of people are going to suffer and die and are at risk of going to hell if they haven't wrestled through who is Jesus. That's a big element of, we don't want to just think about prophecy. Oh, it's curious. Oh, let's argue about it. Oh, how does it motivate us? Last point I would make on that is in Ezekiel 38, verse 7, God says to Gog, the dictator of Magog of Russia, God says to the evil leader, get ready, be prepared. Now, if God is telling the enemies of Israel to get ready and be prepared, what should the Church of Jesus Christ be doing in the lead up to these events?
You have a fund in your first book, The Last Jihad. The fund is the Joshua Fund.
Right.
And it was a fictional fund of portfolio.
Global hedge funds, right?
Yeah. So, but there is such a thing as the Joshua Fund that you have
now, yeah.
that you have set up, and it's to do those things. It's to do those good works that we are called to do as Christians, to bless people, to help people, and to share the gospel with people. So just talk about that for a second.
Yeah. So after The Last Jihad became a big bestseller and I started being invited to speak, people would say, well, Joel, you're basically describing in fiction the horrible things that could be happening in the future in the Middle East, but there are horrible things happening right now. What can we do to make a difference? How can we make a difference? I struggled for several years with a concise answer. I knew many ministry leaders, pastors, organizations, churches in the region here in Israel, but how do you list them at the end of a Q&A at a church or in a sermon? These are mostly small ministries. They don't have websites. They don't, they're not members of the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability. How are you going to just explain this to people? And most of them don't need $100,000. It's about maybe $5,000, whatever. So after several years of prayer and counsel from various Christians, we decided to create what I think of as a mutual fund. People saying, yeah, I would like to give $25 a month, $50 a month, $100 a month. But we need to give it to a trusted organization that has already figured out whom to give it to. And are those ministries legitimate? Are they heretical or are they legit? Are they using the money the way they say they're going to use it? Are they, whatever. So that's what the Joshua Fund is. We needed a name for it.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, why don't we just rip the name out of the first book, the Joshua Fund, and just call it that? And that's what we've done. And over the last 15 years, Jim, we've had the honor of investing more than $80 million into strengthening the church in Israel and in 5 Palestinian churches and in 5 neighboring Arab countries, but also doing humanitarian relief with Syrian and Iraqi refugees, with Holocaust survivors, with widows and orphans here in Israel and so forth. So basically, the Joshua Fund is not a brand here. Why? Because we're funding ministries that already exist so that they are the hands and feet of Jesus. And we're not trying to draw credit, but it is a way that we've tried to create, again, like a mutual fund. People, most people don't pick their own stocks. They go to a mutual fund and say, you know what, why don't you guys do this? You have the experience and you have people that are sort of watching. And if that organization has enough money for now, give it to somebody else.
Yeah.
Or if they need a lot more, maybe we dial it up. How am I going to know from Chicago or from Washington, D.C. or from, wherever? And I love that. I would do that. That's all I would do as the founder. But God has has several things that's cooking in my life, from the books and the speaking and the news sites. So I'm the chairman now. I was the president, but I'm now the chairman of the Joshua Fund. And sort of the public face of it. I love this ministry because at the heart of it, it really goes close to the heart of what I really want to do. But it's not my main skill set to run an international ministry day to day. That's administrations. That's not my gifting. So I do what I do, and we've recruited a great team of staff and board. And I appreciate you asking. We haven't given even much publicity to the Joshua Fund over the years, but God has used it, and we're grateful.
So my last question: a young man who I think around 8 years old, or maybe 8th grade, I don't remember, but you discovered that you were Jewish, didn't realize it, even with the name Rosenberg. So to walk through that, and then how did a Jewish boy that didn't know he was Jewish find Jesus, find Yeshua?
Well, so there's a couple pieces there. First, I did come to faith in Jesus as Messiah, as Savior, when I was 8 years old. That's true. Growing up in upstate New York, a little town called Fairport, just outside of Rochester, New York. Rochester, the home of Kodak and Xerox, Bausch. So I grew up in a little town, and I came to faith at the age of 8 through Vacation Bible School and through Sunday school, which I hated both of those. But God was merciful, and people were nice to me, and they loved me, and they told me about Jesus, and I got it because God opened my heart, my ears, and my eyes. But the real story of how God moved in our family's life was because my parents came to faith. My father was raised Orthodox Jewish in Brooklyn. My mom goes back to the Daughters of the American Revolution. She's from an English Methodist WASP family, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. You go back a few generations in my mom's family, and they have circuit riding, gospel preaching Methodist missionaries. But by the time I got to her generation, she and her mom, she was raised by a single mom. They went to a Methodist church that didn't preach the gospel, didn't know Jesus personally. So my mom never heard the truth. My dad was raised Orthodox Jewish. The only way he knew the name Jesus Christ was when his father would beat him with a belt and say, Jesus Christ Almighty. That was bad. So they both had become agnostics. But they met in 1965 at an apartment complex in Syracuse, New York, central New York. They got married, and they were both agnostics, so they didn't really care. But it was the 60s, and they were seeking, and they decided to buy a Quran and read the Quran. They decided to buy a Bhagavad Gita and think, maybe we should be Hindus. It was very 60s. They tried to read the New Testament. It didn't make any sense. But in 1973, they, in a story that I won't tell in detail right now, but my mom came to faith first. Of course, she had a Christian background, so it wasn't so alien to her. But when she heard the gospel clearly explained, she got it. She got electrified by it. She made her decision to receive Jesus. And she just assumed my father would be excited. My father was not excited. He was like, honey, the one thing I remember from my rabbi in Brooklyn is Jesus ain't for us, But to his credit, he was willing to join a small group Bible study of young couples that my mom wanted to join because she was a new believer. And they were going to go through the gospel according to Luke. And just by going through Luke, reading the prophecies, reading the life of Jesus, by the end, my father came home one day and he said, I can't believe I'm saying this, but I've come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, he is the Savior, and I received him. This was electrifying for them, and it began to transform their life, and I began to see their lives change right before me. I was 6 years old when they got saved, and by the time I was 8, I understood enough, not much, but enough to make my own decision. It wasn't until high school that I sort of wrestled it through for myself. But your point, one more piece of this was the story about not knowing I'm Jewish. I didn't know I was Jewish because my parents didn't tell me. Why didn't my parents tell me? Because my father had had such a bad experience with his parents and his synagogue and his Jewish community in Brooklyn that he'd sort of abandoned Judaism, okay? Now, he was mostly really abandoning the relationships, but to him, everything was tied together with Orthodox Judaism. So he just like, I don't want that. And when he came to faith in Jesus, he began to grow in his faith, and he began to just calm down a little bit. he was teaching a 6th grade Sunday school that he got asked to teach in our little tiny Bible church. And a little girl in that class was like, "Oh, Mr. Rosenberg, isn't that a Jewish name?" "Well, yes, it is." "Well, did you celebrate the holidays growing up, Jewish holidays?" "Well, of course I did." So each holiday she would ask, "Tell us about that holiday." None of the other kids in this little class cared. But she did. So when it got up to Passover, she said, "Oh, Mr. Rosenberg, did you celebrate Passover as a child?" "Yeah, of course I did." "Well, how did you do it? What did you do?" He told her. And then she said, "Mr. Rosenberg, could we have a Passover Seder in our class?" "Well, sure, Angie. Next week we'll do it." Okay. Now he comes home. I'm in 5th grade. This is 6th grade, so I'm not in that class. But he says over lunch that Sunday afternoon, "Hey, listen, I'm going to have a Passover Seder in my Sunday school class next week. I'd love it if you all came." My mom, my sister, and myself. I'm like, "Excuse me, what's Passover?" He's like, "You don't know what Passover is?" I'm now in 5th grade. It's like, "You don't know what Passover is?" I said, "No, that's why I'm asking." So he explains what Passover is. I said, "Well, what's a Seder?" He goes, "You don't know what a Seder is?" I said, "No, that's why I'm asking." All right. So he tells me what a Seder is. Jim, I say to my dad at that point, "How would you know how to do that?" He says, "Because I'm Jewish." I said, "You're Jewish? Does that mean I'm Jewish? How did this never come up?" I mean, seriously, that's how dumb I was. You're like, Joel Rosenberg? You didn't know you were Jewish? Your name is Joel Rosenberg? It's not like exactly French or, Brazilian. No, I didn't know. I was clearly the dumbest kid in my class. But that intrigued me. And a few years later, again, little church, when I joined the junior high youth group, now this little girl, Angie, was in that group. And she said, "Oh, you're Mr. Rosenberg's son." I said, "Yeah." She said, "You're Jewish." I said, "Apparently."
That's what they tell me.
Yeah. And she goes, "That's so cool." I said, "Is it?" But over time, I began to process, this is rare at that time, being Jewish and being a believer in Jesus. So maybe this is a thing I better explore. Why? Why has God been so merciful to my family? And what's my responsibility to my fellow Jews and to the nation of Israel? And I didn't anticipate becoming a citizen of Israel, marrying a lovely girl that I met in college, and then coming here and raising our sons here and having sons serve in the Israeli army, learn Hebrew. So didn't see that coming, certainly not in 5th grade. That's a little bit of my story.
Yeah. But again, a pleasure to get to talk with you.
Oh, thank you, Jim.
Enjoying reading. Now I guess I have to read a lot of books.
Yeah, you got a lot of books.
But they're all on my Kindle. So
okay.
As
you can get them on audio too. You just get them on your phone, on your flight back. You can, okay. So that's good. Well,
but we have our crew, and they're listening. So it's however it works. But listen, nice. You're a blessing, and I appreciate your heart for the gospel to share the most amazing story that there is a God and He loves us, and He proved that by sending Jesus, His Son, to die for us.
Right to this city, and He's coming back right to that mountain. I mean, what a great front row seat for it.
I love it. I love it. Thank you,
Jim. Great to meet you. Thank you so much.
Okay. I was blessed to hear Joel's story of how he realized that Jesus, Yeshua, is the Messiah. He heard the prophecies fulfilled. He found out that Jesus, the Son of God, came and died for his sins. That's the greatest gift in the entire world. So many people think religion is about being good or not doing bad things, but the Bible says we can never be good enough. We've all sinned. We've all fallen short of the glory of God. But there's hope. And the hope is that God would one day provide a sacrifice that would take away sin, not just cover sin, but take away sin. All of the sacrifices that we read about in the Old Testament were pictures of the perfect ultimate sacrifice. And the Bible tells us that Jesus came and fulfilled the law and the prophets. He kept everything perfectly, yet He died perfect for sin. He died for my sins and for yours. And the evangelical message is simple. If you will, by faith, receive Him, put your trust in Him, you will be saved today, tomorrow, and forever.